Hey, you need help? Looks like your key's stuck.
Yeah, it's not opening.
Give me your keys. Quiet. Don't make this hard.
Okay, just don't hurt me.
Wait.
The sound of metal grinding against metal is usually just an annoyance. It is the friction of a cheap key refusing to turn in a weathered lock, a mundane frustration that belongs to a Tuesday afternoon. But in the desolate stretch of a shopping plaza parking lot, that sound changes frequency. It stops being a mechanical failure and becomes a dinner bell. It signals vulnerability. It broadcasts distraction. To the average passerby, a young woman struggling with her car door is a scene of minor sympathy. To a predator, it is an invitation. It is the precise moment the gazelle looks down to drink, exposing the neck. The heat radiating off the asphalt was visible, shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon of the downtown skyline. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. The time is important because violence rarely adheres to the cinematic schedule of midnight shadows and dark alleyways. Real terror often arrives in the bright, flat light of day, amidst the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of pedestrians. It hides in plain sight, camouflaged by the banality of a grocery run or a commute home from school. Inside an unmarked patrol unit, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the temperature, but the chill Detective Sarah Martinez felt had nothing to do with the climate control. She was reviewing the files that lay spread across the passenger seat. Photographs of bruised faces, transcripts of terrified statements, and the digital footprint of a man who had turned the local suburbs into his personal hunting ground. The radio crackled to life, slicing through the silence with a burst of static and a coded message that stiffened her spine against the seat. The target was active. The ghost they had been chasing for 6 months had materialized. For 15 years, Martinez had existed in the gray spaces of society. She had built a career on the architecture of deception, dismantling narcotics rings and organized crime syndicates by becoming whatever the room required her to be. Her colleagues often joked that she belonged on a stage rather than a precinct, but the performance required for undercover work offers no applause, only survival. You do not just recite lines, you inhabit a lie until it feels like the truth. You change the cadence of your breath, the slump of your shoulders, the way your eyes track a room. But this assignment was different. This wasn't about buying drugs or laundering money. This was about becoming bait. The suspect, Marcus Webb, was 25 years old, but his eyes held the ancient hollow look of someone who had long ago decided that other people were merely objects to be used. His pattern was chillingly consistent. He didn't kick down doors. He didn't scream demands. He charmed. He approached with a smile, a helpful suggestion, a mask of civility that disarmed the instincts of the young and the polite. He targeted teenagers in transition, walking from school to their cars, leaving coffee shops, distracted by phones and the invincible ignorance of youth. He looked for the moment the key got stuck. The file on the seat beside Martinez detailed the escalation. It started with wallets and phones, demanded with a flash of steel. But the violence was bleeding into the interactions. The last victim, a 17-year-old girl named Emma, hadn't just been robbed, she had been punished for her hesitation. A pistol whipped across the face leaves a specific kind of scar, both on the skin and on the psyche. It was a brutality that crossed the invisible line law enforcement draws in the sand. This was no longer just about property. It was about the imminent destruction of life. Martinez looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. At 38, life had etched lines of experience around her eyes, a hardness that comes from seeing the worst humanity has to offer. To catch a monster who hunted children, she had to erase that hardness. She had to peel away the layers of the seasoned detective and expose something softer, something that looked breakable. The transformation was methodical. It wasn't just the wardrobe, the oversized hoodie that swallowed her frame, the worn denim, the backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. It was the psychology of the posture. She had spent hours studying surveillance footage, not of the criminal, but of his victims. She watched how they walked, their gazes fixed on glowing screens, their peripheral vision narrowed by the digital world. She practiced the distracted gait, the confident yet oblivious stride of a generation that believes safety is the default setting of the world. She tied her hair back in a simple ponytail, stripping away the makeup, stripping away the authority. When she stepped out of the vehicle, she wasn't Detective Martinez anymore. She was a target. She was the girl whose parents told her to call when she got there. She was the easy mark. The plan was terrifyingly simple. She would walk into the lion's den alone. She would go to the shopping plaza near the community college, a place of transient movement where a student struggling with a car door wouldn't look out of place. She would simulate the very mechanical failure that Webb looked for. She would fumble. She would look frustrated. She would wait for the shadow to fall over her. As she moved into position, the weight of her service weapon, concealed in a specialized holster beneath the loose fabric of her jeans, was a cold comfort. The wire taped to her chest felt like a second heartbeat, a thin technological thread connecting her to the 6 officers hiding in the periphery. But in the moment of contact, a wire cannot stop a bullet. A backup team, no matter how elite, is always seconds away, and life or death is decided in milliseconds. The parking lot was vast and exposed. The sun beat down on the hood of the decoy car. Martinez leaned against the metal, pulling out her phone, scrolling through nothing, forcing her body to relax into the casual slouch of a bored student. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she had to keep off her face. She fumbled with the keys. She dropped them. She sighed loudly, a performance for an audience of one. Then, the auditory landscape shifted. Footsteps. Not the rhythmic clip of a shopper in a hurry, but the slow, purposeful prowl of a predator assessing the terrain. She didn't look up. To look up would be to show awareness. She kept her eyes on the keys, jamming the wrong one into the lock, twisting it until it caught. A voice drifted over her shoulder. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't shouting. It was smooth, helpful, and laced with a terrifying faux concern. The stranger asked if she needed help. He observed that her key looked stuck. The trap was set. The invitation had been accepted. Martinez turned, widening her eyes in feigned surprise, forcing a smile of gratitude onto her face. But as she looked at the man in the gray hoodie, standing just close enough to invade her personal space, she saw what the files couldn't capture. She saw the deadness behind the smile. She saw the way he positioned himself to block her escape route, a subtle shift of weight that turned a conversation into a confinement. He asked for the keys. He told her not to make it hard. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the static electricity of imminent violence. He thought he was looking at a frightened girl who would hand over her life to avoid a scene. He didn't know he was staring into the eyes of a mirror, and that the reflection looking back at him was not a victim, but a reckoning. The radio in the backup van went silent. The world narrowed down to 2 people standing on a patch of hot asphalt. The key was stuck. The wolf was at the door, and Sarah Martinez was ready to open it. The architecture of a nightmare is rarely built on chaos. It is built on routine. It hides in the mundane friction of a stuck key, the banal frustration of a stalled engine, and the helpful voice of a stranger in a sun-bleached parking lot. For Detective Sarah Martinez, the world had shrunk to a 3-foot radius around the driver's side door of a Honda Civic. The air was thick with the scent of hot asphalt and the metallic tang of adrenaline that she had to swallow, forcing it down so it wouldn't tremble in her hands. She was no longer a 38-year-old veteran of organized crime units. In this terrifyingly narrow slice of time, she was prey. She was the distracted student, the vulnerable girl with the ponytail and the oversized hoodie, the exact demographic that Marcus Webb had been hunting across 3 counties. He moved into her personal space with the fluid confidence of a man who had done this before. He didn't rush. Predators who rush make mistakes. And Webb was not a man of mistakes. He was a man of patterns. He stood too close. It was a subtle violation, a calculated encroachment designed to test her boundaries. If she flinched, he would know she was aware. If she froze, he would know he had control. So, she did neither. She played the part of the grateful innocent, offering him a confused smile, thanking him for his concern, while every nerve ending in her body screamed that a monster was standing within arm's reach. Through the hidden earpiece, the silence of the backup team was deafening. They were listening to a ghost story unfold in real time. They could hear the smooth, baritone timbre of his voice as he offered assistance. It was a performance of chilling normalcy. He suggested tricks to jiggle the lock, his tone dripping with a brotherly solicitude that made the skin on the back of Sarah's neck crawl. But beneath the brim of his gray hoodie, his eyes were not looking at the lock. They were scanning the perimeter, darting left and right, checking for witnesses, evaluating the sightlines. He was calculating the geometry of the abduction. Sarah saw it all. Through the filter of her feigned incompetence, her detective's eye was dissecting him. She noted the scar on his left hand, a jagged white line that matched the case files perfectly. She saw the heavy, unnatural sag in the front pocket of his hoodie, the unmistakable gravity of a concealed firearm. It was a small caliber pistol, likely the same one that had cracked a 17-year-old girl's skull just weeks prior. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a suspect. This was him. The file had become flesh. He maneuvered slightly to the right, a casual step that seemed insignificant to an observer. But to Sarah, it was a tactical declaration of war. He was blocking her retreat. He had placed his body between her and the open walkway, hurting her against the metal of the car. It was the kill box, the psychological cornering that preceded the violence. And still, he talked. For nearly 2 minutes, he maintained the charade, asking about her classes, her day, lulling her into a false sense of security while he waited for the parking lot to empty, just enough to make his move. How many times had he played this scene? How many young women had stood exactly where Sarah was standing, their hearts fluttering with gratitude for the nice man helping them, only to realize too late that the help was a handcuff? Then the atmosphere shifted. The air pressure seemed to drop, sucking the oxygen out of the afternoon. Webb stopped smiling. The friendly neighbor mask didn't just slip, it evaporated. He took one more step forward, eliminating the last inch of social distance, invading her sphere with a suffocating intensity. His voice dropped an octave, shedding the helpful cadence and replacing it with the cold, flat steel of a command. He told her the game was over. He demanded the keys. He demanded the purse. And he told her, with a chilling lack of emotion, that if she made a sound, he would hurt her. This was the pivot point. This was the moment where the victim's mind usually shattered, where the cognitive dissonance between the helper and the attacker caused a paralysis that Webb relied on. He expected tears. He expected the stammering plea of a child bargaining with a nightmare. Sarah gave him exactly what he wanted. She let her shoulders slump, shrinking into herself, projecting a terrified compliance that fed his ego like a drug. She whimpered that she didn't have much money. She offered him everything, her voice trembling with a perfectly calibrated frequency of panic. Webb relaxed, just a fraction. He saw the fear in her eyes and mistook it for submission. He didn't see that the fear was a cloak, and beneath it, a seasoned tactical mind was running a countdown. He didn't realize that while she was fumbling with her bag, playing the part of the hysterical victim, she was actually adjusting her stance, shifting her weight to the balls of her feet. She was moving him. With every terrified step back she took, she was drawing him deeper into the trap, aligning him with the sightlines of the 6 officers hidden in the periphery. He pulled the gun. It emerged from the hoodie, dark and ugly against the sunlight. He pressed it into her ribs, using his body to shield the weapon from the few distant pedestrians. The hard metal against her side was a violation that transcended the role she was playing. It was a lethal reality. One twitch of his finger, one miscalculation, and the operation would end in a coroner's van. He hissed at her to hurry up. He was getting impatient, the thrill of the control mixing with the urgency of the crime. He thought he was holding a terrified girl hostage. He thought he was the apex predator in this concrete jungle. He had no idea that the prey he had cornered was holding a silent detonator in her palm, and that the trembling girl before him was about to bring the sky down on his head. The tension stretched, taut as a piano wire, vibrating with the potential for sudden, catastrophic violence. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide and watery, capturing the image of his face in this moment of supreme arrogance. She needed him to commit fully. She needed him to believe he had won. He jabbed the gun harder. He leaned in, his breath hot on her face, whispering a final threat that would have frozen the blood of anyone else. But Sarah Martinez wasn't frozen. She was ignited. The duality of her existence, the scared teenager on the outside, the warrior on the inside, fused into a single kinetic point of focus. The trap was primed. The wolf had bitten the hand, and he was about to find out that it was made of iron. The illusion of dominance is a fragile thing. It exists only as long as the victim agrees to play their part in the tragedy, to shrink, to weep, to offer up their agency on a platter of terror. Marcus Webb stood in the center of that parking lot, bathed in the golden, deceptive light of late afternoon, believing he was the author of this scene. He felt the weight of the gun in his hand and the trembling body of the girl beside him, and in his mind, the narrative was already written. She would hand over the keys, she would beg, he would take what he wanted, perhaps strike her just to see the shock bloom on her face, and then vanish back into the shadows from which he had crawled. He was high on the specific toxic oxygen of absolute control, but the girl was not trembling from fear. She was vibrating with the coiled, kinetic energy of a spring compressed to its breaking point. Sarah Martinez felt the hard ridge of the barrel digging into her ribs through the thin fabric of her hoodie. It was a sensation that would have paralyzed a civilian, a cold point of contact that whispered of ruptured organs and sudden darkness. But for Sarah, it was a tactile cue. It was the starter pistol. Her thumb found the small concealed button on the device palmed in her left hand. She didn't press it with panic. She pressed it with the cold, administrative finality of a judge slamming a gavel. The signal was silent, invisible, a digital scream cutting through the airwaves, but the reaction was tectonic. The perimeter collapsed. It didn't happen like it does in the movies, with sirens wailing and tires smoking. It happened with a terrifying, disciplined swiftness. The maintenance workers near the college entrance dropped their brooms and drew weapons with fluid, practiced motions. The unmarked sedans at the edges of the lot roared to life, their engines growling as they surged forward to block the exits. The atmosphere in the parking lot shifted instantly from a lazy afternoon to a combat zone. Webb sensed the shift before he saw it. The predator's instinct is sharp, attuned to changes in the environment, and he felt the sudden pressure of eyes, the sudden closing of the net. He looked up, his eyes darting left, then right, and the arrogance drained from his face, replaced by the feral panic of a trapped animal. He saw the figures closing in, the dark windbreakers, the glint of badges, the level muzzles of service weapons. His world fractured. In that split second of cognitive dissonance, Webb made the choice that separates the desperate from the damned. Instead of dropping the weapon, instead of surrendering to the overwhelming force bearing down on him, he tightened his grip. He jerked Sarah backward, jamming the pistol harder into her side, screaming threats that were lost in the rush of blood in his own ears. He tried to pull her into him, to transform her body into a shield of flesh and bone that would buy him a few more seconds of freedom. He made the mistake of assuming she was dead weight. This was the pivot. This was the moment the masquerade dissolved. Sarah didn't pull away. She didn't scream. She moved into the threat. It is counterintuitive, a violation of every survival instinct nature grants us, but it is the cornerstone of close quarters combat. You do not retreat from the blade, you stifle it. As Webb yanked her back, Sarah stepped in, matching his momentum, closing the distance until there was no room for him to leverage his strength. Her hand, the one he thought was paralyzed by fear, shot up. It wasn't a flailing, desperate slap. It was a precise, brutal mechanic. She clamped onto the barrel of the weapon and the meat of his wrist, controlling the line of fire, diverting the muzzle away from her vital organs and toward the empty asphalt. In the same breath, she drove her body weight into him, using his own backward momentum to unbalance him. Webb's eyes went wide. He wasn't looking at a teenager anymore. He was looking into the eyes of a 15-year veteran who had been waiting 6 months for this exact heartbeat. The confusion on his face was total. The soft, pliable victim had suddenly turned into iron and granite. She twisted. The torque on his wrist was immense, a leverage point designed to snap ligaments and force compliance. Webb's fingers, acting on a reflex of pain, spasmed and released the grip. The gun clattered to the pavement, a heavy metallic sound that signaled the end of his reign. But Sarah wasn't finished. She didn't just disarm him, she dismantled him. With a fluidity that blurred the line between violence and art, she swept his legs, driving him into the ground. The impact was sickening and satisfying, the sound of air leaving lungs, of a body hitting the unforgiving reality of the earth. He hit the asphalt face first, and before he could scramble, before he could even process the inversion of his universe, Sarah was on top of him. Her knee drove into the small of his back, pinning him with the weight of authority. The vulnerable student was gone. In her place was Detective Martinez, her voice dropping an octave, shedding the high-pitched affectation of youth to bark commands that brooked no argument. The backup team swarmed the scene, a wall of blue and gray blocking out the sun. Hands grabbed Webb's arms, pulling them back with professional roughness. The ratchet of handcuffs clicking into place was the loudest sound in the world, a mechanical punctuation mark ending the sentence of his violence. Sarah stood up, her chest heaving, not from fear, but from the massive dump of adrenaline that floods the system when survival is on the line. She brushed the grit from her jeans, adjusting the oversized hoodie that had served as her costume. She looked down at Marcus Webb. He was twisted around, his cheek pressed against the dirty pavement, staring up at her. The look on his face wasn't just anger, it was a profound, shattering bewilderment. He couldn't reconcile the images. He saw the ponytail, the sneakers, the backpack, the symbols of the prey he hunted. But he also saw the stance, the handcuffs on her belt, the steely, unforgiving gaze of the law. He had spent years studying his victims, learning their weaknesses, their blind spots. He thought he knew everything about the dynamics of power. But as he lay there, breathing in the dust of the parking lot, Marcus Webb realized he had made the fatal error of the arrogant. He had looked at the surface and failed to see the depth. He had come hunting for a lamb and had walked voluntarily into the jaws of the lion. The radio on Sarah's belt crackled to life, a dispatcher's voice cutting through the heavy silence of the aftermath. It was a mundane sound, routine and bureaucratic, but it signaled the return of order. The chaos was contained. The monster was in chains. Sarah watched as two officers hauled Webb to his feet. He looked smaller now, stripped of his weapon, stripped of the element of surprise, and stripped of the fear he used to inflate his own stature. He was just a man, a pathetic, dangerous man, now bound for a cage. She reached up and tightened her ponytail, a simple human gesture that bridged the gap between the character she had played and the woman she was. The pivot was complete. The trap had sprung. And as the patrol car door slammed shut, sealing Marcus Webb away from the world he had tormented, Sarah Martinez finally allowed herself to take a breath. It tasted like gasoline and asphalt, but mostly it tasted like justice. The handcuffs were only the beginning. In the weeks that followed the takedown in the parking lot, the physical struggle gave way to a cerebral war, a battle fought not with firearms and adrenaline, but with evidence bags, search warrants, and the cold, unyielding logic of the law. As Detective Sarah Martinez transitioned from the streets back to the sterile fluorescent glare of the precinct, the true scope of the monster she had trapped began to reveal itself. The investigation led them first to Webb's apartment, a space that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum of stolen moments. In the suffocating quiet of his bedroom closet, detectives unearthed the trophies of a predator who believed he would never be caught. It wasn't just cash or pawnable electronics. It was a collection of identities. Driver's licenses, student IDs, and credit cards were stacked with obsessive precision, each one representing a life interrupted, a sense of safety shattered. But the darkest discovery was a journal, a handwritten manifesto of domination that chilled even the most seasoned homicide detectives to the bone. Webb hadn't just been robbing people, he had been grading them. The pages were filled with detailed critiques of his victims' fear responses, analyzing how easily they crumbled, how quickly they begged. He rated them on their vulnerability, documenting his methods with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying insects. The handwriting revealed a man who was escalating, a predator who was growing bored with simple theft, and was actively fantasizing about abduction and total control. The psychologists who later reviewed the text confirmed what Sarah already felt in her gut. The undercover operation hadn't just solved a string of robberies, it had almost certainly prevented a murder. Yet, in the interrogation room, Marcus Webb did not look like a monster. He looked like an indignity. He sat slumped in the metal chair, radiating a petulant fury that had nothing to do with remorse. His arrogance was breathtaking. He didn't speak of the teenagers he had traumatized or the women he had pistol whipped. Instead, he complained about fairness. He spoke of the undercover operation as if it were a breach of contract, a cheat code used by the police. In his twisted worldview, the sheep were supposed to remain sheep. For a wolf to disguise itself as a lamb was, to him, a violation of the natural order. He truly believed that the weak existed solely to sustain the strong, and his only crime was falling for a trick. This philosophical narcissism became the cornerstone of his legal defense. As the case moved to the courtroom, the air grew thick with the tension of a final showdown. The defense attorney, grasping for any lifeline, attempted to paint the picture of entrapment. They argued that the police had manufactured the crime, that Webb was a troubled young man lured into a situation he wouldn't have otherwise sought out. It was a desperate, offensive narrative that tried to turn the predator into the victim and the protector into the instigator. But the courtroom is a theater of truth, and the prosecution was ready to pull back the curtain. The witness stand became a procession of trauma. One by one, the victims came forward. Young college students, service workers, teenagers, their voices trembling as they recounted the moments their lives changed. They spoke of the nightmares that didn't end when the sun came up. They described the crushing anxiety of walking to their cars, the way the sound of footsteps behind them now triggered a panic attack. One young man confessed he had dropped out of university because he could no longer handle the open exposure of a campus quad. These weren't just property crimes, they were thefts of potential, stealing the future peace of mind from an entire community. Then came the mother. Webb's own flesh and blood took the stand, not to defend him, but to weep for what he had become. She sat in the back rows, a portrait of maternal grief, describing a child who had curdled into something unrecognizable. She spoke of early warning signs, of cruelty to animals, and a lack of empathy that no amount of therapy or medication could fix. Her testimony stripped away the defense's argument that Webb was merely misunderstood. It laid bare the terrifying reality that some darkness is innate, a rot that starts at the core and works its way out. The climax of the legal war, however, arrived with the press of a button. The prosecution played the audio recording from the wire Sarah had worn during the operation. The courtroom fell into a pin-drop silence. Suddenly, the well-dressed defendant sitting at the table vanished, replaced by the voice of the beast. The jury heard the terrifying shift in tone, the way his friendly offer of help curdled instantly into a lethal threat. They heard the guttural demand for compliance, the pleasure he took in the fear of a young girl. The audio tape bridged the gap between the sanitized legal proceedings and the gritty, violent reality of the street. It showed the jury the face behind the mask. Webb's demeanor in the courtroom shifted as the tape played. The mask of the victim slipped. He glared at the jury, his eyes hard and flat, revealing the same predatory gaze Sarah had seen in the parking lot. There was no sorrow there, only the simmering rage of a man who realized his power had been stripped away. The deliberation was swift. The jury, having looked into the abyss of Webb's psyche, needed less than 3 hours to return with a verdict. Guilty on all counts: armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping. The judge, a stern figure who had seen enough of humanity's worst to recognize true danger when it stood before him, handed down a sentence that acted as a final seal on the tomb: 25 years. As the gavel came down, the sound echoed like a gunshot, signaling the end of the hunt. Sarah watched from the gallery, her face impassive, but her heart lightening. There would be no parole hearing for a decade and a half. The streets were safer. The predator had been caged, but more importantly, the narrative had been corrected. The legal system had affirmed that the sheep were not there to be eaten, and the shepherd was always watching, ready to become the wolf when necessary. Marcus Webb was led away in chains, his future reduced to a 6x8 concrete box. He left behind a legacy of fear, but he also left behind a blueprint for how to defeat men like him. As the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him, cutting off his last view of the free world, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the heavy, profound silence of justice finally, and irrevocably, served. The steel doors of the penitentiary slammed shut on Marcus Webb, a final, resonant boom that severed him from the world he had treated as his personal hunting ground. But the true end of a case is rarely found in the turning of a lock. The legal war was over, yet the echoes of the violence and the strange, quiet healing that follows began to ripple outward in ways no police report could ever document. For Detective Sarah Martinez, the weeks following the sentencing were defined not by the adrenaline of the chase, but by the weight of paper. Letters began to arrive at the precinct, white envelopes that felt heavier than they looked. They came from the shadows, from the victims who had been watching the trial from the safety of their living rooms, people who had carried the invisible scars of Webb's terror for months or years. One letter stood out, written on college-ruled notebook paper by a 19-year-old named David. He had been one of Webb's earlier targets, a young man who had been broken by the encounter, who had dropped out of school because the simple act of walking across a campus quad felt like navigating a minefield. He wrote to Sarah not just to thank her, but to tell her that the image of Webb in handcuffs had triggered a resurrection. He was returning to his studies, but the trajectory of his life had shifted. He was changing his major to criminal justice. The trauma that had once paralyzed him was now the fuel for a new engine. He wanted to stand on the line between the wolves and the flock, just as she had. It was the ultimate defiance. The predator had tried to create a victim, but instead, he had inadvertently forged a future protector. 6 months later, the true closing argument of the case was delivered not in a courtroom, but in a high school gymnasium filled with the scent of floor wax and cheap bouquets. Sarah sat in the bleachers, an anonymous face in a sea of proud parents, watching the graduation ceremony. She was there for Emma, the girl whose brutal assault had sparked the operation, the final victim who had unknowingly set the trap. When Emma walked across the stage, the transformation was visceral. The terrified, concussed girl from the case files was gone. In her place walked a young woman with her chin held high, the tassel of her cap swinging with a rhythm of reclaimed confidence. She was heading to university to study psychology, driven by a need to understand the mechanics of trauma, to help others piece their shattered lives back together. After the ceremony, amidst the chaotic joy of families reuniting, Emma's father found Sarah near the exit. He was a retired sergeant, a man whose face was etched with the weary geography of decades on the job. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached out and took Sarah's hand, his grip firm, calloused, and trembling slightly. In the deep, silent language of law enforcement, a conversation passed between them that required no voice. He was acknowledging the debt of a father who realized he couldn't protect his own child, and the gratitude for the detective who had stepped into the breach. He told her that, for the first time in a year, his daughter slept with the lights off. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of the universe, but in that gymnasium, it felt like a triumph of the human spirit. Yet, even as the light returned to the victims, the darkness of what Webb represented became clearer and more terrifying. Post-conviction analysis of the evidence seized from his apartment painted a picture far grimmer than a simple string of robberies. The detectives found the digital footprints of a monster evolving. Webb hadn't just been looking for easy targets, he had been farming them. He had used social media algorithms and geotagging to stalk specific demographics, creating a database of vulnerability. His journals, written in a cramped, obsessive hand, revealed a man devoid of a conscience. There was no remorse in his writings, only a cold, mechanical frustration that his game had been interrupted. He viewed his victims not as people, but as resources to be harvested for his own sense of power. The psychological profile was chilling. Webb believed that empathy was a weakness and that his predation was a natural right of the strong. The realization settled over the department like a cold fog. Sarah hadn't just stopped a robber. She had intercepted a serial killer in the larval stage. The escalation was written in the margins of his notebooks. The leap from robbery to abduction and murder was not a possibility, it was a scheduled eventuality. This knowledge transformed the shadow identity operation from a success story into a legendary case study. Sarah found herself standing at podiums in lecture halls across the country, teaching veteran officers about the architecture of the undercover mind. She spoke not of the disguise, the makeup, or the slang, but of the psychology of the bait. She told them that, to catch a wolf, you cannot simply dress as a sheep. You have to understand the terror of the sheep. You have to let your heart rate spike, let the cortisol flood your system, and yet, keep the steel trap of your training primed to snap shut. She recounted the moment Webb's hand had closed around her arm, the visceral, electric shock of being physically possessed by a monster. A young detective in the front row asked her if she had been afraid. Sarah didn't hesitate. She admitted that terror was a constant companion, a cold passenger in her chest. But courage, she explained, is not the absence of fear, it is the mastery of it. In the end, the legacy of the 247 pursuit wasn't the 25-year sentence or the headlines. It was the quiet restoration of order. It was David patrolling the streets of his hometown. It was Emma studying late into the night, unafraid of the shadows. And it was Detective Sarah Martinez sitting in her unmarked car on a new stakeout, watching the world with eyes that had seen the abyss and refused to blink. Justice, she realized, was not a gavel or a prison cell. Justice was the ability to walk to your car in the afternoon sun, fumble with your keys, and know that the only thing waiting for you was the drive home. The predator was in the cage, the sheep were safe, and the shepherd was still watching, blending into the scenery, ready to become the wolf the moment the wind changed.